My name is Ryan. I'm from southern Oklahoma, and I'm half Native American on my mom's side. My grandpa, who was born in the year 1912, was full-blooded Comanche, and much like a lot of the elders from around his time, he had a lot of stories to tell. These weren't his own stories, and they were passed down from his grandfather in turn, and they're from a time before the Wild West was tamed, as they say. He used to tell us some pretty wild tales sometimes of how our ancestors would talk to spirits using peyote cactus, or how they could shoot nickels out of the air with their bows and arrows. Most of Grandpa's stories were either interesting or insightful like that, but every so often, he'd tell us something a little darker. Now, I'm no expert in Native American history or culture, so I'm not going to pretend to be able to speak for other tribes, but I know that a lot of tribes were mostly peaceful hunter and gatherers who only went to war to defend themselves and their land. The Comanche were not one of those tribes. Basically, a bunch of other tribes forced the Comanche out of Wyoming and south into the Great Plains of Texas and Oklahoma. This is because we sucked at everything. We couldn't fight, we couldn't farm, and when we got to the plains, life sucked even harder because the whole place is basically one big grassy desert. But then, the Comanches got horses from the Spanish, and because we didn't have much else going for us, we decided to get really good at riding horses. This gave us a huge advantage over, well, just about everyone. And because we had a huge chip on our shoulder, we decided to get a little payback on all the other tribes. We beat the Apache, who'd been bugging us ever since we arrived on the plains, all the way down into Mexico and Nevada. I mean, we were kicking it hard and taking names all the way from Kansas to Corpus Christi, but that's about where I stopped being proud of it. I know it's an overdone bit to be like, war isn't glamorous, y'all, but in the case of the tribes of the Great Plains, it's a gigantic understatement. Yes, we stuck it to the settler colonizers for like 100 years, but we did it in some pretty disgusting ways. Nowadays, wars have rules, but back then, it was anything goes, and that whole scalping thing really is just the tip of a very gory iceberg. Kids were routinely killed, women were made into slave wives, whole families were tortured until they just straight up died. The settlers did some evil stuff to us too, but it's like the Comanche made war crimes into an art form. But that's just the way things were back then. Like I said, anything goes. All that nasty stuff said was, hey, don't mess with us or you'll get this too. But still, it makes me glad that I was a 70s kid and not an 1870s kid, you know? Anyway, like I said earlier, every so often Grandpa would break out a horror story for just us boys. It makes me cringe a little to think about it now, but back then, those were my favorite kinds of stories to hear from him. Call it that morbid curiosity that all teenage boys have, but I was really into hearing about our people's badass past. And if I thought that it was an appropriate moment, I'd bug him until he told me one. He told me a few humdingers over the years, let me tell you, but the one he saved for Halloween when we were all hitting our mid-teens had the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. So, picture the scene. It's like the 1850s or whatever, and the war between my ancestors and the white settlers is at its peak. We'd raid some homestead, steal a bunch of horses, and then ride off onto the plains to make our escape. Inevitably, we'd end up getting followed by a bunch of soldiers or Texas Rangers who planned on getting revenge and taking back the horses. Now, on paper, getting chased like that isn't ideal, but the reality is, us Comanches enjoyed it when the Texans followed us out into the plains. See, we traveled much lighter and had our pick of the best horses, so we'd always end up escaping. Then as the raiders wandered around the plains running out of food and water, we'd just hide out somewhere and watch them. After a few days, the rangers would be really low on supplies, and you gotta remember, these dudes would ride for days at a time trying to catch us. They weren't just in and out real quick, 20-minute adventures, as they say. They rode for hundreds of miles at a time. But then, on their final night's camp before heading back to civilization, Comanche warriors would sneak up to their horses in the middle of the night and stampede them off into the plains before the rangers knew what hit them. A really skilled group of warriors would stampede the horses through the rangers' camp, wounding and killing a few of them while robbing them of their transport in the process. The result would be a few dozen stranded rangers facing a 7-day walk with no food or water if they ever wanted to see home again. And by the sounds of things, not many of them did. Grandpa said that a lot of the time the Comanche wouldn't even waste bullets or arrows on the stranded rangers. They just watched them on horseback from a distance, taunting and laughing at them. Some men collapsed from heat stroke and died where they fell. Their comrades were forced to keep going, probably looking back in time to see their friends being scalped and butchered. I can't even imagine how horrifying it must have been to see that, and to wonder how long it'd be before it was your turn to die. Dehydration killed the next bunch, and when the group of rangers was in a weak enough state, the Comanches flew in, finished them off, and then went off looking for their horses to add to their collections. But every so often some ranger or soldier proved much tougher than the others and could be seen wandering back home alone long after their fellow rangers had died or deserted them. These were the guys who actually earned a little respect from the Comanche, but unfortunately, not their mercy. In fact, it became a kind of a game to mess with the final survivor. The Comanche would do things like pour water on the ground about 100 meters ahead of them and then watched as they rushed to suck up the mud it produced. They'd do other stuff like ride up real fast and then lean over to one side and then slap the lone survivor around the head before laughing. I asked Grandpa why the ranger didn't shoot him, but he explained that they'd be too weak to hold their rifles by that point. All they had left were swinging a knife or hatchet all pathetically while the Comanche screwed with them. The point is, it became a game to do stuff like that, and more often than not, the Comanche ended up killing this lone survivor, stripping their corpses, and then riding off to do it all over again once they were good and ready. Anyway, in this one story, my Comanche ancestors are trailing this lone surviving Texas Ranger, waiting for him to drop his rifle so they can swoop in to start messing with him. He'd been going on no food or water for a long time, kind of going along through the grass into the featureless horizon, longer than the warriors had ever seen any lone survivor go before him. And then finally, he spins around, takes a wildly inaccurate shot at the Comanche's direction. The bullet whizzes harmlessly past them and the Comanche start laughing and taunting the ranger. But then, the ranger starts laughing back at them. Confused, the warriors ride in closer, then draw down with their lances on him. Most other in his place would have tried to run or fight. Heck, some even took their own lives to save them from what they knew was coming. But instead of doing any of that, the ranger tears open his shirt, points to his heart, and with a big smile on his face, starts goading them to kill him and get it over with. The Comanche didn't understand what he was saying, but with a gesture like that, it didn't need any translating. The Comanches looked at each other, impressed by the man's bravery in the face of death. But as they did so, the man shoved aside their lances and carried on his march along the plains. Obviously, the Comanche followed the man on their horses, watching in bemusement as he continued laughing and joking with himself. To try and find out if the man was brave or if he'd simply lost his mind, one of the Comanche leaned in with their lance and stabbed the man in the arm deep enough to draw a heavy amount of blood. The man didn't cry out in pain. Instead, his laughter intensified. He then tore off his shirt and began cupping his hand under the wound, letting his own blood pool in his palm before he gulped it down in a mad, desperate thirst. Now to us, this is a clear sign as any that the guy had completely lost his mind. But drinking blood wasn't nearly as extreme to the Comanche as it is to us. If they were in a bad spot and couldn't find any drinking water, it wasn't uncommon for the Comanche to drink a little tortoise or jackrabbit blood to prevent them from keeling over. So to them, having this guy drink his own blood wasn't a deciding factor in if he was crazy or not. I can already hear most of you asking, why does this guy's mental health have anything to do with how the Comanche are going to treat him? Well, if a person was really brave, then it was an honor to kill them and take their scalp. But if they were crazy, the Comanches believed that they had bad magic about them. It was no honor to kill someone barely capable of defending themselves, and whatever badness was in their victim, it might jump to them, to put it simply. The Comanche didn't have any set religion or anything like that. They had their customs and traditions, but spirituality tended to be a person-to-person thing. Some warriors prayed to lucky trinkets for protection, others worshiped pet crows, but everyone agreed that there was a kind of magic in the world. Sometimes that magic worked for good, sometimes for bad. So still unsure that the lone survivor was mad or not, one of the Comanche rode forward, intent on taking a trophy. He scalped the survivor, standing up, slicing around the base of his skull before pulling away at the bloody mess of hair and flesh. Again, the man just laughed louder and harder when another might have just howled in agony. And once the warrior was done, the lone survivor turned around, saw his own bloody scalp flapping in the wind, and began to clap. As you can imagine, it took a lot to freak out a hardened Comanche warrior, but the display the scalped and bloodied survivor was putting on was unlike anything they'd ever seen. It took a minute or two before they figured out what they wanted to do with him, but in the end, they decided that they had to break him. This guy was human, and a weak European one, they thought too. He might have been acting strong like a Comanche, but they were going to prove that he wasn't all that. They jumped off their horses, knocked the guy to the ground, then tied him up and staked him down. The Comanches then got a small fire burning, stripped the dude naked, and then lay him near the fire, legs spread, with the fire near his you-know-whats. The plan was to drag him closer and closer to the fire, legs wide open until his junk was burned to a crisp, and even the most incredibly courageous of warriors broke at the threat of that. But once again, the shirtless, blood-soaked, scalpless survivor just laughed, and this time, he starts nodding his head as if to say, "Do it, do it." And this was the last straw for the Comanches. If this guy didn't care about his junk getting roasted, if he actually wanted it, then there had to be something deeply wrong with him, and the Comanches took that as some very bad magic. Kill a person with that kind of magic in them and the effect could be deadly, not just for the warrior who did the deed, but their entire extended family too. With that being the case, the warriors just left him there, and then rode off before the guy's bad magic could follow him. The last they saw of the guy, this guy was walking back home, naked as the day he was born, scalpless, and covered in blood. And for around a quarter mile, they could still hear him laughing to himself. Of all the stories my grandpa told me, that's the one that creeps me out the most. Because it's not really about evil spirits or demons or any of the messed up things the Comanches or the Texan Rangers did. It's about how war can make a man lose his mind to the point he's not even really a person anymore. It's like he went out, thinking that he was fighting monsters, and then became one along the way. If you enjoyed this scary story, listen to thousands more, either over on the Let's Read YouTube channel or podcast.